All right. Hello, everybody. So what I'd like to talk a little bit about now is what's called nested Crud. And this is essentially a way of organizing your Django projects when you're dealing with things like one-to-many relationships, because you'll want a way to access all of the X that belong to Y. So that's what we're going to be doing today, using nested URLs and nested resources. So everything we've been doing up until now has been CRUD that applies to a single resource. So one model for quite a while. But in full stack applications, you're going to have multiple resources and multiple models that all interact with one another somehow. And so there's this concept called nested CRUD, where you nest certain resources under other ones in your URL. So the present resource is the top level, followed by the child level. If you nest your URLs, you'll generally only nest 2 resources, but you could theoretically nest an unlimited number. So we're going to see it in action in a bit. So we're going to make an application today to keep track of Platoon cohorts and students. So we want to be able to CRUD a cohort and its associated students as well. So first off, I'm just going to make a project. So I'm going to call this nested CRUD example. I'm going to create a virtual environment. Eventually. Then I'm going to activate it. Install Django. And then I'm going to start a project. We'll call it cohort tracker. So I'll open it up. I'll probably need to activate my virtual environment again because it's a new window. I'm going to navigate inside the cohort tracker, and I'm going to create a new application. Start app, call it cohorts and students. So now if I open this up, we have all of our file structures is here ready to go. Next, I'm going to go to settings.py so I can register my application. Cohorts and students. And then I'm going to get our models going. So first one is going to be a cohort class. And it's going to have a .model. There we go. It's going to have a cohort name. We just call it name. And that'll be models.char field. It'll have a start date. So that'll be models.date field. And an end date. Models.date field. I'll make a string method. And that'll return something that looks like this, perhaps. Name equals self.name. Start date equals self.start date. All right, and then we'll set up a student class. I can remember how to do that. Models.model. So student will have a first name. And a last name. All right, we also need to make sure that we can associate a student with a cohort, because one cohort has many students, but a student only belongs to one cohort. So how do we set up that association between students and cohorts?
You can have something called like, I don't know, cohort, and have it be a model.foreign key.
Yep. So cohort equals models.foreign key. And it's going to be, the associated model is cohort. We'll say onDelete equals models.cascade, which means that if we delete a cohort, it'll also delete all of its associated students. And we'll set the related name to be equal to students. So the related name key argument there will say, okay, not only we are saying that each student has a cohort, but each cohort has students that it'll be able to access. And also set up a str method. So ID equals self.id, first name equals self.firstname, and last name equals self.lastname. Then I should be able to make migrations. And then migrate. All right. So now I want to make sure I've got some test data here. So let's use the admin panel for that. Who remembers how we can add our models to the admin panel? Where do we go for that? So we go to admin.py. Let's say from.models, we're going to import cohort and student. I'm going to say admin.site.register. And I believe we can't, I'm not sure, I think we can do it this way. If not, we'll have to do that in separate lines. Now I'm going to create a super user. Student object has no attribute URLs. Okay, so I've done something wrong here. I'm just going to try doing it this way, admin.site.register student. I think maybe we need to, well, we shouldn't have to do that yet. Let me try this again. There we go. You know what, codeplatoon.org. Password is Platoon. Yes, I know it's too short. Make it anyway. And then I'm going to run the server. Nope, get out of here. Go to localhost 8000/admin. I should be able to log in as Noah Heinrich, password Platoon. All right, so I've got cohorts and I've got students here. So if I add a cohort, I'll say, we'll have alpha Platoon starts, I don't know when it started, so I'll just say February 4th, end date today. Why not? And we'll add another, Bravo, start date, random dates, like so. Now I'll add some students to both of them. So I'll say, say I have a student here. So we'll say, all right, Colin M in alpha, Jerry S, it's also an alpha. Fraser C, it's in Bravo. And Ross G is in Bravo. So if I click on here, I can see the associated cohort. And I go to cohort here. It won't actually let me see all of its associated students from here, I suppose. All right. What questions do you have about what we've done so far? This is all things that we've already done previously. But what questions do you have? Okay. So in that case, I'm going to do a couple things here. First, in my URL things in the project level, I want to make sure that I am importing path and include. I'm going to say path is to cohorts. We're going to be including cohorts and students.urls. Then we need to make a urls.py file. I'm going to say from Django.urls, we're going to import path from .import views. Set up my URL patterns list. All right. Now I'm going to set up, first I'm going to set up the kind of standard ones you've become used to. So this will be our cohort list. So views.cohort list. Name equals cohort list. New is going to take us to our form. So views.new cohort. Name equals new cohort. Then we'll have our viewing one. So int cohort ID will take us to views.cohort detail. Name equals cohort detail. And then we'll have one for edit and one for delete. So int cohort ID / edit. Views.edit cohort. Name equals edit cohort. One day I'll spell cohort right on the first try. Int, oh, need those carets. Int cohort ID / delete. Takes us to views.delete cohort. Name equals delete cohort. All right. So this should all look pretty familiar, right? This is our standard kind of CRUD pattern that we've been following for the last couple of days. So the question is now, we need to figure out, all right, what about students? Because these are all things for creating new cohorts and all of that. So let's say I want to see from a cohort, I want to see all of a cohort's associated students. The path for that and our nested CRUD will look something like this. So of int cohort ID, like we've been doing, /students, will take us to views.studentList, and name is going to equal student list. So in this particular case, if I want to look at all of Alpha Platoon's students, I would go to the URL I would go to would be localhost 8000 /cohorts/1/students, and that would show me all of that cohort's particular students.
I have a question on that.
Yeah.
So in your models, did you name them A and B, the cohorts? Or when you're populating the data in the Django admin panel?
I named the cohorts Alpha and Bravo. Yeah.
So is there a way to get, instead of 1 and 2, like I see where you're going with 1 and 2 for the cohort,
Mm-hmm.
is there a way to get the string passed in, like cohort A, passed into the view, or not the view, but the URL instead of the integer?
Yes, there's nothing that's forcing you to structure your URLs like this. You could say, instead of passing in an ID, I'm going to post in a name. And depending on your application and what you want to use it for, that may be the pattern you would like. I think it would probably look like something like, instead of int cohort ID, it would probably be str cohort name.
Okay.
The disadvantage of this is you have to make sure that you don't have any duplicates in your data, because ID numbers are guaranteed to be unique, and you have to make, if you want to use names, then you'd have to make sure that your names are all unique as well, which is possible.
Okay. So even in production databases, like big ones, like say, for instance, Amazon, or where they have thousands or hundreds of thousands of accounts, they have, each account holder has a unique ID in their database somewhere, I'm guessing. Is that how it works? And then if you delete your Amazon account, that ID is never recycled?
I would assume so. This is, again, assuming that you're using a SQL database, because that's essentially the pattern we're using. If it's using some other type of database, it may follow different patterns. And this kind of concept we're using here, this pattern is sometimes called REST, R-E-S-T, and restful routing. And this is a very common pattern of, okay, here's your /new ID number, ID/edit, ID/delete, ID/etc. That's kind of considered standard practice in frameworks like Django and Rails. But you can definitely, you can and almost certainly will deviate from that kind of standard pattern depending on the needs of your users.
Got it. Thank you.
No problem. And kind of continuing this RESTful routing here. So this is, essentially this line here is the nested equivalent of this one right here. So we can just essentially keep on building this out. So we could say, to make a new one, we would just say int cohort ID /students/new. Now take us to views dot new wow, suddenly I'm new student. Name equals new student. And then here we could say, just essentially keep on doing that pattern. So we wanted to get the details of one student. So it'd be cohort ID / students / and then we can add in a second argument of int student ID, which takes us to views.studentDetail. Name equals student detail. And then again, for edit and delete, it's going to be almost the same thing. It's going to be continuing to get longer and longer. And this is again why you don't typically want to nest more than have more than 2 in these, because it can get real long, but you certainly can. So int cohort ID / students / int student ID / edit use.edit student, name equals edit student. And then finally, if we want to delete it, /students / int student ID / delete. Takes us to views.delete student, name equals delete student. All right, so these are nested URLs. So essentially all it is you say, okay, I have one resource, I have the typical routes, and then another resource can just be tacked on to the end of that. So I can say, if I want to see the details of a specific student, I would first say, okay, what's the student's cohort ID? Show me all of its students, and then show me that particular student's ID. What questions do you have about nested URLs?
I think it'll be easier to see how this works once we start adding stuff.
Absolutely. And I'm actually going to comment out all of the student resources for now, just so we can, because the application won't work if we don't have all of our views made, and that's a lot of views to make. So for now, I'm going to just do the cohort views, and then we'll add the student views afterwards.
I have a question.
Yes.
I looked up REST and it said it stood for representational state transfer. What does that mean?
That's a very good question, and I don't know the answer to off the top of my head. I do know that REST is an architectural style for defining routes. I'm not entirely sure what representational state transfer actually means, though. This is one of those things that I learned how to do, but not necessarily why it's called what it is. Right. So I'm going to start adding views to my Django project. So I'm going to make sure I'm importing render and redirect. I'm going to say from .models, I'm going to import cohort. From .forms, I'm going to import cohort form. We haven't created forms or cohort form yet, but we will. I'm going to make a helper method for getting a particular cohort. So get cohort ID. And that just returns cohort.objects.get, where ID equals cohort ID. And then I'm going to start making my views. So cohort list takes a request. Cohorts equals cohort.objects.all. We will return render with request. Cohorts / cohorts list, which we will make later. And cohorts, like so. Get the cohort details of one. So request a cohort ID. We'll say that cohort equals get cohort using our helper method. And we'll return render request cohorts / cohort detail.html. And cohort is going to be the cohort. Nope. All right. So I know I'm going pretty fast on this because, again, this is all stuff we have covered before, and I don't want to linger too long on it. But does anyone have any questions about these GET requests before we move on to talking about forms and things like that?
One quick question on passing data. So in this case, you're passing a dictionary, but if you wanted to pass another variable in one of your methods, could you just add that variable to the dictionary?
Yeah, you can absolutely add as many. You can add as many key value pairs to your dictionary as you like.
Okay, thank you.
How do you think about whether you want to use a function or what is it, class view?
So when you say a function versus a class view, what do you mean?
Is there a way, like when you're creating the views, are there like certain things where you always, when you're doing it, do you think about like, oh, this would be better as a class view, or this would be better as a function?
Well, I think in general, most of your views do have to be a function in order to work, if that's what you mean.
Oh, are you
Because
talking about a class template, Emma?
You can use whatever most comfortable for you. There isn't a tried and true thing.
Yeah.
What you should use.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if we should like try to use class views or like try to use functions, or like if one was better than the other. But Tom, you answered it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to make the new cohort thing. New cohort is going to be a request. And we'll say if request.method is post. We'll say that form equals a cohort form, which again, we have not written yet. Request.post. If the form is valid, we will save it. I like setting commit equal to false just in case we need to add something else. Cohort.save. So we could just do it. We could just save it immediately with commit equal true, but I always like doing that just in case you want to change it later. Then we'll redirect to cohort detail, where cohort ID equals cohort.id. And if it is not a post request, you will create a cohort form. And then render the request to take us to our new form. Cohorts / cohort form.html. Form is going to be the form, and the type of request is going to be new. I'm going to copy this because the edit function is almost identical. I spelled request wrong. And so the difference here is we are still, this one also takes a cohort ID. You'll say that cohort equals get cohort. And then if it's a post request, form equals cohort form with request.post, and where instance equals the cohort. And this can remain the same, where we will save the form, save the cohort, and then redirect to the cohort detail. Else we want to render the form. In this case, it'll be a cohort form where the instance is equal to the cohort. And then we will return render with the request, cohort form.html. Form is form, and the type of request will be edit. And then finally, if we want to delete a request, we say delete cohort, request, and cohort ID. If it's a post request, cohort equals get cohort with the cohort ID, cohort.delete. And then we return redirect to cohort list. All right, so again, these are our views. We've done this before. Does anyone have any questions about our views before we move on to forms and our templates? Okay. So next I'm going to add some forms. So I'm going to make a new file called forms.py. I'm going to say from Django, I'm going to import forms. From .models, I'm going to import cohort and student. Make a class called cohort form, which inherits from forms.model form. There we go. Of the class meta. Model equals cohort. And fields are going to be name, start date, and end date. And while we're here, let's make a student form. Forms.model form. Class meta. Model equals student. Fields are cohort, first name, and last name. All right, next I'm going to make a new folder called templates. Inside templates, I'll make one for cohorts. And I'll start making some HTML files. So cohorts list.html. So h1 cohort list. We'll have an unordered list here. It'll be a very basic view. We'll say for cohort in cohorts. We'll have a div. Inside that div, we'll have a list item. And inside that list item, we'll have a link where href equals. This is going to be a URL helper, URL to cohort detail, where cohort ID equals cohort.id. And inside of that link, we'll have our cohort.name. Nope, okay. Cohort.name. And then at the bottom, we have our end for. And then I'll also have a link that'll take us to our URL to create a new form, or create a new cohort. So URL new cohort. We create a new cohort. All right, What questions do you have about this particular, this particular template? All right. In that case, I'm going to kind of dive through the rest of them real quick so we can get to the nested part, because that's what we're here to learn today. Let's make a new file, call this one cohort detail.html. There's a big div here with a heading that'll be cohort.name. We'll have some p tags, start date. It's going to be cohort.startDate. End date is going to be cohort.endDate. We'll put a line break and then a link to edit the cohort. href equals URL, edit cohort, where cohort ID equals cohort.id. And we'll just say edit this cohort. Have another line break, and then we'll have a form for deleting the cohort. So where form name equals delete cohort. Method equals post. And action equals, and that's where we'll have our URL helper. URL delete cohort. Where cohort ID equals cohort.id. And inside that, we'll have our CSRF token. And input where type equals submit. And submit. And value equals delete cohort. Like so. And then finally, we'll have our form. So cohort form.html. H2, okay, and H1, that's fine too. Where we'll display the type of request that we defined earlier. Cohort, so we're saying whether this is for editing a cohort or making a new cohort. We'll have our form, where method equals post. What the heck? Method equals post. Have our CSRF token. And then display our form.asp. And then have our submit button. All right. Any questions about how we have done this? This is all stuff we have done before, but it never hurts to ask questions about it again. I'm noticing an error with my URLs. I think, yeah, I was going to comment this one out too. Boop. Okay, so if I go to localhost admin, localhost 8000/cohorts, I have alpha and bravo. If I click on one, you have start date and end date. If I edit this cohort to say it started on the 5th instead, I hit save. Now it says February 5th. If I go back to cohorts, create a new cohort, should be able to do Charlie. Was that the next one after Bravo?
Yes, and yeah.
2019, end date 3-3-2020. See if that accepts that. Those are not considered valid dates. Like I said, it gives me those arguments automatically. Don't remember exactly how they want that formatted in this case, though. Maybe it's got to be slashes. There we go. All right. What questions do you have before we make this a nested app?
I have one quick question regarding the validation there.
Yeah.
So the way you got it to work just now, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the only way that it'll pass. It could accept many different variations, right? Depending on how the form is made.
Yeah, so depending on how the form is made, it could do different things. I'm curious, if I open this up and inspect it, I'm curious to see if this is something that's done through a rendered HTML or not. So we have name, start date, required ID. All right, so this isn't a function of HTML. This is a function of Django, it looks like. So I'm guessing that in that case, I'm going to be guessing that this has to do with Django's date field. So it looks like the Django date field accepts it with the slash pattern. It may accept it in other ways. And if you wanted to make it, if you wanted to format it so that it could accept other things, you could, for example, have something in views.py that properly, for example, a new cohort, you could say, all right, here I want to make sure that the data is properly formatted on the back end so that I don't have to worry about it on the front end. That's one way of doing it. You can also use a HTML, I believe in HTML you can get a specific type of input field that actually just inputs a date automatically, lets you do a drop down and select it. So there are several ways to do that, yes. But if we don't make any of those changes, it looks like it'll just, it's weird that it looks like it only has certain ways of rendering it. So it looks like it'll accept year dash month slash dash day or day slash month slash year. Looks like it's pretty finicky that way. All right, so now let's make this so that we can also add students to this. I'm going to uncomment out all of my routes for students. And then I'm going to change my views here to add a few more things. So from .models, I'm also going to import student. And I'm also going to import my student form. And essentially at this point, it's going to be almost identical in certain ways to how I did it before. It's still the same actions, just with a few minor differences. So I'm actually going to copy everything and paste it because I don't want to have to type it all out again. So I'm just going to say, this is going to be our getStudent method now, which takes a student ID. Returns student.objects.get, where ID equals student ID. And actually, I'm wondering if I could just do clever use of Command D here. Change all of this to students. You know what, that's a little, I don't want to take action that big yet because I may end up regretting it. Because there's a few other things I got to do. So for example, my student list, if we look at my URLs, student list takes a cohort ID as an argument. So I got to make sure I have that here. In this case, I need to make sure that first, my cohort equals using my getCohort method with the cohort ID. And then I'm going to say that students equals cohort.students.all. And then I'm going to return render with my request. I'm going to send this to students studentslist.html. And I'm going to pass it in the cohort and the students.
You got 2 S's in your students on line 52.
Thank you very much. And then for student detail, it's going to be taking a cohort ID and a student ID. So the cohort, I'm still going to use the get cohort. Student is going to equal get student with the student ID. And then I'm going to return render students/student detail, where cohort is cohort and student is student. And then for making a new student, there's a few extra steps. Still going to take a cohort ID as an argument. And cohort equals get cohort. And then if request.method equals post, form equals student form with request.post. If form is valid, student equals form.save. And then student.cohort is now equal to cohort. And then student.save. And then we will redirect to student detail, where the cohort ID is going to equal cohort.id, and student ID equals student.id. And else we are going to render our students/student form. Right. And then edit student is going to be very similar. Takes a student, cohort ID, and student ID. So we're going to say cohort equals get cohort, student equals get student. Form equals student form. Your request.post, and where instance equals student. If the form is valid, student equals form.save, student.save. Redirect to student detail, where cohort ID equals cohort ID, and student ID equals student.id. Else form equals another student form, where instance equals student, which takes us to students/studentform.html. And then finally for deleting, takes cohort ID and student ID. If the request method is a post, student equals get student with that student ID, student.delete. And then we're going to redirect to the student list, where the cohort ID equals cohort ID that we passed in here. All right. What questions do you have about these views?
You have a typo on line 72.
Thank you very much. Every time. I did it again.
Hey, Noah, could you scroll down? I think it should be late 85 should be delete student.
Yeah. Okay, there we go. So we have our views set up. All right. So this should all look pretty familiar because nesting it like this is pretty much the same thing except with a few extra steps because you have you have this other argument of the parent resource. All right, any other questions about the views before we do make our templates?
You have your cohort controller at the top, right? Still, okay.
Mhm. Yeah, we still have all of our cohort views
Okay.
as well. So I do a little, just to differentiate them.
Instead of taking cohort ID as an argument, could you also do a query to grab certain students from a cohort? Oh, never mind. I see why you need the ID now. Okay, answer my questions.
Yeah.
All right.
And you may notice, though, that for something like student detail, if every student has a unique ID number, why do we need its cohort number? And the short answer is that's, again, one of those patterns that's considered to be standard practice. There's no reason that we couldn't do it so that our student detail didn't require the cohort ID, since the cohort doesn't necessarily have to be invoked here. But this is considered standard practice. So it's important to know what the standard is before you deviate from it. All right, so before I make some new templates, I'm going to add just another link to my cohort detail. I'm going to say have a horizontal rule here, and then have a link, href equals, and this is going to be our URL that goes to student list. For cohort ID equals cohort.id. I forgot the % there. And just say students in this cohort. Now I'm going to.
Is that typo in line 14 where cohort ITD?
Oh, thank you. See, this is why pair programming is important, so people can catch these things. All right, now I'm going to make a new folder in templates for students. So now I have one folder. Oops, put that in the wrong place. Can delete it. I don't want it to be. I want to be inside templates, not inside cohorts. Keeps on trying to do that. 1 second. Going to do this the old-fashioned way. So go into cohorts and students. Go into templates. And here I'm going to make a directory called students. There we go. Sometimes the GUI does not do what you want it to do. So now I'm going to make a few methods here. I'm going to make a file called student. Did I call it students list or student list? 1 sec. Students list. All right, got to make sure I am consistent there. Students list.html. And then I'm going to go back to cohort detail because I want to make sure that this is also students list. Make sure urls.py. What did we call it here? Okay, it was called here student list. All right, so I want to make sure everything has got to be what it's supposed to be. Okay, so the view is called student list, but the template is called students list. All right, got to make sure you're careful there because otherwise you could really mess yourself up. So now, for my students list in my views, if I take a look, as data, I'm passing it both a list of students and a cohort. So I have both of these to work with now. So if I do H1, I can say all students for cohort.name. I have an unordered list. And we'll say for student and students. Have our end4 down here. And for each of these, we'll have a div. Inside that div, we'll have a list item. And inside of each list item, we'll have an A tag, where the href equals URL student detail, where cohort ID equals cohort.id, and student ID equals student.id. And then we'll show our student.firstname, student.lastname. And then down here, we'll have our link. That'll take us to the new student form. URL is new student. Cohort ID is going to be cohort.id. And it'll say, add a new student. And so now when we make our student form, so student form.html, kind of the advantage here is that we don't have to have the user choose from a list of cohorts and they make a new student. The cohort is kind of built into this form about which cohort they're going to make. So if I do have an H2 here and say, call this type of request a student for cohort.name cohort. Have my form where the method is post. Get our CSRF token. Do our form as P with a button whose type is submit. And you'll save. And then finally, I'm going to make my student detail.html. Say, have a div here. A heading where we say student.firstname, student.lastname. Have a p tag, member of cohort.name. Let's have a break. And we can have our link to edit the student. URL to edit student. Where cohort ID equals cohort.id. Student ID equals student.id. Edit student. Have a break. Have our delete form. So form whose name equals delete cohort. Delete student. Method equals post. action equals URL, delete student, or cohort ID equals cohort.id, and student ID equals student.id. Have our CSRF token. And we have our submit button. Type equals submit. Value equals delete student. And now if I restart the server, provided nothing breaks. So far, so good. So I click on Alpha Platoon. Uh-oh. All right, reverse for students list not found. Students list is not a valid view function or pattern name. All right, so we need to figure out what happened here. So when I went to my, so this is when I tried to go do my cohorts view. So I went to cohort detail. And then if I went to my cohort detail here. Okay, I think I need to call this student list, not students list. I think that was the problem. Refresh the page. There we go. So now if I click on students in this cohort, I go to, all right, we go to cohort/1/students. And then we have another reverse pattern thing, something went wrong here. So it was error during template rendering. Reverse for new student with arguments not found. So we can take a look at our students list.html. And it said right here the problem was with the new student thing. URL new student. I forgot the equal sign. There we go. So I've got Colin M and Jerry S. I click here. Did it again. All right, this is another problem during template rendering in my form. Or is that student detail? This is right here. It's problem with my edit student link. So URL edit student cohort ID equals cohort.id, student ID equals student.id. Oh, wait, no, edit student. All right, what does it actually say? Could not reparse the remainder equals from student ID. Interesting. Did I misspell something?
Hey Noah, is there a space on line 5 between student ID and student.id?
Yes, there was. There we go. Thank you. So we have Jerry S, who's a member of signed alpha. If I try to edit Jerry, so it does actually let me change his cohort from here. So I do Jerry Seinfeld, hit save. So if I do cohort/3/new, sorry, /student/new, I should be able to make a new student. If I do Noah Heinrich, started 11/11, ended 11/12/2019. Okay, wait a second. It shouldn't be showing this looks like the cohort form. So we have another problem here. Look at new student. I did something wrong again. Form equals student form. If I go to my student form.html, form.asp, new student for cohort. Interesting. All right, so something's going wrong here because I should be seeing the cohort name right there, and I'm not. And it's showing me the cohort form instead of the student form. So I'm not seeing any errors here in terms of my GET requests. So it's not breaking, but go to Views, New Student, goes Request and a cohort ID. Cohort equals get cohort. Form equals a student form. If form.isValid, here it is. Form equals cohort form, not student form. That's why copying and pasting can also be dangerous. There we go. So using form as P actually automatically renders, this thing of choosing a foreign key. You won't always do that. Normally you might have something that says cohort/2/students, and it would automatically assume that you would be making a cohort for that a student for that cohort. So add me to Charlie Platoon. Here I am. Go to student/cohort/2. Bravo. Okay. So I think I'm still getting some weird issues here, where it added me to Bravo instead of Charlie for some reason. So if I wanted to edit myself and say, move me to Charlie, let's see what happens. Still says member of Bravo. So it looks like maybe that drop-down menu isn't doing what I thought it did. Okay, now it's showing me there. Okay, maybe it just needed to refresh. Okay. Anyway, so that's nested CRUD in a nutshell. What questions do you have about it?
Can I see your student detail HTML file?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, not the HTML, the view. I meant the view.
All right, student detail. There you are.
So when you nest them, that lets you pass information from the thing that it's inside of to it. And then when you create the HTML, you have access to the student and the detail because it's nested.
Exactly. Great. What other questions do you have about nested CRUD? Okay. One thing I do want to say is pay attention to this topic because nested CRUD is going to be on a future assessment, hint, hint. So the assignments we do today are important to keep in mind. I believe assessment 4.3, which assessment number is it? I believe that's next week, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Assessment 4 is on December 11th.
Okay, so not next week. Oh, right, because next week is Thanksgiving. Okay, so either way, nested CRUD is going to be coming up again. So I'm going to stop recording, and then we can take a look at today's assignments.